Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Spark. I'm Katie Rubery from the Issuer Services team here at the London Stock Exchange, and today we are going to be talking about the evolution of the investor relations landscape. Specifically, what do those new to the IRO role and function need to know and consider as they transition? Enabling dialogue between issuers and investors really lies at the heart of the London Stock Exchange and indeed our wonderful Issuer Services team. It is evident that the strategic role and importance of investor relations is becoming more pronounced. And in an evolving ecosystem, the role of an IRO is becoming increasingly diverse and demanding. With that, I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts today who will unpick a number of important questions and themes over the next hour. We'll be discussing how IR teams can align their corporate strategy with emerging trends, all the way down to best practice when it comes to engaging with investors through strategic storytelling, and of course, much more. We have a packed agenda today and we'll be hearing from some fabulous speakers. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Jenny Fulton, Managing Partner at Empra, Amani Korean, Director of Corporate Product and Partnerships, EMEA at Extel, Helen Woodgush, Sustainability Solutions Specialist at S&P Global, and Katie Forbes, Head of Investor Relations at Capital Gearing Trust. A very warm welcome to you all and many thanks for joining me on this panel today. Before we begin, just a very quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and anyone who wants to revisit the content or share with any colleagues can do so by revisiting Spark, where this webinar will live as a video on demand going forward. This is designed to be an interactive session. We've already had a number of questions from the audience on registration, so thank you very much for those. But we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the course of the conversation today using the functionality built into the platform. You'll see the Ask a Question option on the top right-hand side of your screen. The questions will come to me and I will present them to the panel during the Q&A section at the end. So I'll now hand over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves before we get into the conversation. Jenny, if I could start with you, please. Just on mute, Jenny.
Thanks, Katie. It's great to be here. Jenny Fulton, I'm Managing Partner at Empra. At Empra, we're one of the UK's largest reporting and creative corporate communications agencies. And I've actually spent, I worked at nearly 25 years, which makes me feel really old now, advising and supporting investor relation teams on their reporting and their stakeholder communication. So it's great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. Amani?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm delighted to be here on this webinar and sharing the platform with fantastic experts here today. So my name is Amani Koraim. I'm the head of corporate product at Extel for Europe and Emerging EMEA. Extel, you may know, previously institutional investor research and renowned for its 50-year legacy in independent performance evaluation and perception research across the sell side, buy side and the corporate space, and our annual rankings are very much regarded as the industry standard for excellence in investor relations. Each year we actually scope over 2,000 stakeholders from the buy side and sell side to actually assess their corporate counterparts completely independently across 20 performance metrics around investor relations, but also the executive management team. And the results of this research has become very important to the corporate universe because it allows them to benchmark their own activities year on year to monitor how it's tracking with their investor audiences and their sell-side audiences, but importantly also to benchmark that against their sector peers, their regional peers, or even their global peers. So it's an important metrics and barometer to kind of track every year to ensure that you're optimizing your investor relations activities. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amani. Helen?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning. It's great to be here. I'm Helen Woodgush. I'm a Sustainability Solutions Specialist working at S&P Global. So I don't think S&P needs much of an introduction, but we're a data analytics technology firm focused on bringing transparency to global markets through our data and insights. So welcome to all the panelists and great to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. And last but by no means least, Katie.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Katie Forbes. I'm Head of Investor Relations for Capital Gearing Trust. So Capital Gearing Trust is a multi-asset investment trust that's listed in the its constituent to the FTSE 250. I've been in the role for this particular role for a year now, so I'm probably the newest in terms of investor relations. So very excited to hear what the rest of the panel have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, ladies. Very much looking forward to hearing from all of you today. So, Katie, perhaps with that, if we start with you to set the scene for today's conversation, given what we're speaking about. So, going back to the fundamentals, what does the role and purpose of an IRO actually look like today? How would you say this has maybe evolved over the years? And as you newly transition into an IRO role, what are the key things to focus on and have front of mind?
Great question, thank you. So investor relations is one of those roles where the more you do it, the harder it is to actually describe it. On paper, it's about making sure investors and analysts understand your company. That's your story, your financials, your long-term value. But in practice, it's so much more layered than that. And the role today looks very different from how it used to look. Traditionally, IR might have been more reactive, more finance heavy. So you would have predominantly handled results announcements, earning calls, and investor Q&A. Now it's evolved into a much more strategic role. So now you're expected to be part analyst, part communicator, part internal advisor, part strategist, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And the importance of the role, it keeps getting a lot more strategic and more pronounced. How it looks day to day for each of us, but each of those in IR really varies based on the company structure and the size of the company. So I work for CG Asset Management, which is a tiny company. There's only 12 of us. So not only am I doing investor relations, but I'm also doing corporate communications, PR, and sales. So it's very strategic, and every day is very different. Whereas, for example, my best friend has the exact same job title as me, but she's a lot more strategic. She works closer with the CFO. She has teams that manage the corporate comms and marketing. So her role is a lot more defined than mine. And I think whoever you talk to in the IR industry, each job of ours just looks slightly different. It's a very, very nuanced position to have. So for those joining IR and starting off in the role, I think you really need to, the first thing to do is understand the company. So understand it back to front, ask all the questions you can, meet with as many people internally as you possibly have time to do, as well as talking to investors and just understanding general feedback. I think you just need to build strong relationships and internally and externally, and just try and be adaptable. Every day is going to be different, so just keep trying to learn and carry on, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. That was incredibly insightful. And Helen, I take it you might have some views as well, because I understand you actually started your career in IR, didn't you?
Yes, but I kind of fell into it. I think a lot of people fall into IR. I started working as a deputy financial officer for a global mining company listed on the London Stock Exchange. And so my role evolved into IR. I would say that the fundamental, there are sort of a couple of elements really of the role. The first is really to be able to interpret financial and strategic developments in a way that resonates with different stakeholders. So typically what you find with IR, you're dealing with lots of different stakeholders, internal, external, everyone's looking for different messages. I think the key role of the IR was really to bring together all those strands internally to the organization. So that's finance, strategy, sustainability, and operations, and get comfortable with the detail. Whether it's with the capital structure or missions trajectory or remuneration policies, building credibility with investors is often built through depth and clarity. So I think, building relationships and going deep is what I would advise from the get-go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. And Jenny, Amani, any thoughts to add on that one?
Yeah, I just add, I think that's all so true. And it's quite funny. A wise old investor relations director said to me recently, Jenny, good IR is all about control. It's controlling the narrative, controlling the analysts, at times controlling your leadership team, but ultimately it's about keeping control of your time to enable you to manage the multitude of hats that an IRO has to wear. I think that's so true. I think Katie coined it really well when she was saying actually she's she's investor relations, but she's also doing comms, she's also doing PR. There's all sorts of things you're having to manage and plates you're needing to spin. So, and also it varies so much from company to company, dependent on the team and the structure that you have around you.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with the previous panelists. I think it's changed so drastically over the last few years, even though, like previously mentioned, every company will have a very different approach to investor relations based on the size or the structure, or how IR is actually understood internally as a strategic function. I think that is also really an important aspect. But overall, I think it's certainly moved from a very reactive finance focused role to something that is a lot more multifaceted, that is requiring a lot more proactivity, creativity, and really the ability to actively also influence the business strategy. So we're seeing, based on some of our data, we're seeing a lot more investor relations individuals who have been in IR also for longer periods actually now have a seat at the board table. So this obviously in itself indicates that this is a very highly recognized function within the corporate function, and they are looking to actually hear the sentiment from the street through investor relations. So I think it's a really important development, and it gives a lot more credibility and validity to the function. And I think it makes it, as a result, a function on its own legs. Like Helen mentioned, most people have slipped into investor relations and have never really decided to go on this path. But I think more recent developments around the function is really indicating that it's becoming something to aspire to, something that is integrated into the educational system as well. But in terms of sort of starting new in IR, I think one of the key aspects for me is basically internal stakeholder engagement. So if you're new to IR, it's really about understanding, who the business owners are within the company, who are the different department heads that you have to liaise with, that you have to build very strong relationships with, because these are ultimately the people that will provide you with information, insights, development on, products or innovation that you can then use in turn to position that kind of information as part of your investment narrative into the market, and really present that with great authority and credibility. So having that is really quite essential. And we're seeing also, based on some of our data, that about 38% of any kind of stakeholder engagement that IR does is really internally focused, in terms of engaging with different business leaders and management, of course. And I think the other element that is really important is when you start off is really, doing your market intelligence, gathering as much information and feedback about the company, about the market that you're in, your peers, and speaking to as many people internally as well as externally. Take the views of management, board, employees, but also, ask and speak to your top investors, your sell-side analysts, whether spec sale, trading or research. I think getting that kind of immediate feedback on how they perceive the company is really quite critical as a starting off point. And then ultimately, I think it's really important to create a framework, how to measure investor relations. I think, a lot of companies use the share price performance as a kind of indicator for how good or effective IR is. I think this needs to be explored further to use more qualitative aspects that really measure the impact of your activities, of your engagements, to really represent investor relations and what you're actually creating in terms of transparency and nurturing those relationships much more authentically and fairly.
Wonderful. Thank you, ladies. That was incredibly insightful. So of the many hats that we've uncovered that investor relations officers wear, one of the main hats is obviously communicating your value with investors. That's at the very core of the IRO function. So let's spend a little bit of time on the fundamentals of communicating well. So, for example, what channels would you say investor relations officers should and do use? How do you understand and prioritize your audience? And how might some of the fundamentals like your company website and the annual report process really feed into this? I'm sure you all have thoughts on that, ladies, but maybe if we start with Jenny.
Thanks, Katie. I think with all of that, first of all, it's just about being really clear on your corporate messaging. So who you are, what you do, how you talk about your equity story and investment case, those critical components that make up a corporate narrative. So be really clear on what those messages are and sense check that you're articulating them clearly in a connected way. Then it's just about being consistent. There are a number of touch points, channels and tools you'll use, and look at all of these holistically. Your website, annual report, presentations, investor meetings and events, social media, all of these should support that narrative and reinforce it. And you'll have a calendar of key events that you need to plan for, so your results, annual report, trading updates, etc. But also creating a steady drumbeat of communications between all of these is really important. And there's a couple of channels that you mentioned that I'll pick up on. Firstly, your corporate website. I always say to people, think of this like the mothership of truth and the key platform for telling your story. It's one of the few places where you can control the narrative. It's the central place that stakeholders are going to come back to check information, download reports, and it should be like the shop window for all that brilliant messaging you want to embed. So make the most of the website, make sure it's up to date, it's easy to navigate with key information accessible. It should be backing up all the things that you're talking about in investor meetings. But here you can also have videos, you can have animations, all the stuff that kind of provides that extra context and a deeper dive into some of your initiatives and progress. And then there's the annual report. Now, happens every year, all sorts of stakeholders involved in the process, an ever evolving plethora of mandatory disclosures that need to be included. But when it's done well, it's an opportunity to reiterate your story once again and set out your key messages with impact and clarity. And your involvement in the annual report process as an IRO is going to vary depending on the structure of the overall team. I meet some IROs who find themselves leading the whole process and holding the pen on the strategic reports. This is not always a responsibility that is met with the greatest levels of joy and enthusiasm, I hasten to add, where others will just be supporting and adding to areas of content. Whatever that looks like for you, I'd really say my advice would be embrace your involvement. The annual report process dictates a point in time, whereas an organisation, you need to look back and talk about how you've performed over the past year. But equally, you're looking forward and you're reiterating all those plans and focus for the future. So use that process to sense check your narrative, ensure that everyone's aligned and keep that clarity of message on track. And I think the final thing I'd say on the annual report is once it's published, don't miss the opportunity to leverage the content, the information gathering of data points, the stories, the examples of your strategy in action, progress towards ESG goals, all of that stuff that supports the annual report narrative. It's like a treasure trove of content and assets to support the rest of the year's investor comms. So the website, your social channels, presentations and so on. And at Emperor will often create like a really simple bank of social media assets from the annual report that then you can use on your LinkedIn post, for example. So don't leave all that rich content in the report. So there's a load of other things, but I'll let other people answer on some of the other areas. But yeah, annual report, corporate website, brilliant opportunity. Embrace the process. Don't run away from it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jenny. Very insightful. Helen, perhaps if I come to you next.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Jenny's saying, and also obviously the sustainability report, integrated reporting. Coming from S&P, we're very data-driven in the way that we think, having data-driven narratives that investors can get behind, showing trend analysis, really being able to understand and bring into the organization what investors are looking for. I think the IRO really has an opportunity to, they're meeting external stakeholders all the time, being able to gather up what do investors want to hear about? What does the company need to talk about? What are the peers talking about? And bringing all of that into the organization. So I think it's a good opportunity to really help to shape that kind of sort of narrative storytelling, the messaging for the year, the following year, what happens at the half year. It's a pivotal role. I just wanted to also say that, the channeling is important. LinkedIn, use of LinkedIn, use of social media. I mean, my day, we didn't use social media. We ran away from it. We didn't even have social media. I'm that old, but, we didn't use social media, but, this is people consume their their information and their data on phones, and it's a good opportunity to reach out to people. That can be, your sort of traditional investor, but also retail investors are also part of the story now. So using all channels available, but making sure that the content is appropriate for the channel and the platform that one is engaging with. So that's what I would say, having a very clear comms plan across these platforms and channels is key.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. Very, very helpful. Katie, Amani, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'll quickly go now. So I think at its core, like good communication in IR is all about clarity, consistency, and credibility. Pretty much exactly echoing what Helen and Jenny were saying. But I think what's really important when it comes to communication is really knowing your audience. So who are you actually talking to at that particular time? Are you talking to an analyst that's covering your stock? Are you trying to prepare materials for the retail investor in mind? Because obviously there are different compliance things you need to keep in mind there. And then just making sure that the channel you're using is appropriate for that. So if you have more of like a formal update, that probably just belong in like a webinar setting. But if you're more about like storytelling and building investor relationships, I think you can have like an informal coffee catch up or even just a quick meeting with the team. So I think it's really understanding your audience and understanding the channels available to you. And that's how you can be impactful in IR and communication.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, agree with everything that has been said, and not much to add. I think it's really know your shareholder, know how they consume information, the kind of platforms that they're also engaging with. I think it has become obviously a lot more harder for investor relations, because not only do they need to maintain their own website and their own corporate communication collateral, but also make sure that all the aggregators, all the other platforms that investors are basically accessing data through, that they also reflect the company's information accurately. And I think this is really also a tricky thing with the amount of data that is actually available. And to Katie's point as well, I think it's really important to leverage those different channels as well in terms of engagement, that obviously take a much more of a broad brush kind of approach and allow the dissemination of your corporate communication to a wider audience, whether it is a retail audience, whether it is an institutional investor audience. And we've seen in continental Europe quite a few examples now where companies have actually set up their own corporate investor relations LinkedIn channels, for instance, where they update the market with relevant, conferences that they're attending, or earnings releases, where we find the head of IR, giving a summary of the earnings releases, or conversely, on the other side, for retail investors, we've seen some consumer businesses actually that do webcasts with retail investors, or they do shareholder engagement through roadshows with retail investors through the banks or building societies. So the scope, I think, has widened so much in terms of what type of information you're bringing to the market and how that is packaged. But like Katie said, and others said, it is really about understanding, who you're trying to address with what type of information.
Wonderful. Thank you all. That was very, very insightful. So actually sticking with that point there about understanding who you're speaking to and getting in front of the right audience. Investor targeting is obviously a huge part of the IRO role. It's all very well having your message in there, but you need to make sure it's in front of the right people and in front of the right stakeholders. So what would you say that best practice looks like in this realm when it comes to communicating with existing investors and indeed targeting the correct new investors for your company? Maybe if I start with Amani on that one.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Katie. I think targeting shows in our corporate insights research that we canvass basically with investor relations officers in Europe as one of the top 5 biggest challenges, and it remains a challenge. It's something that is never really perfected, but as Nick Stone from Fresenius once said, targeting is actually an art form. And it's really quite interesting because the way to go about targeting is really, again, going back to understanding who the investors are that are holding currently your stock, who the investors are that are holding your peer stock, but also looking outside of your peer comparison to look potentially at companies not within your sector, but who actually share the same fundamentals. And you're kind of trying to, really start off very, very broad and then, narrow it down further and further, because ultimately when you think about targeting, you think about, roadshows and NDRs and so on and so forth. You want to make sure that you're really maximizing the opportunity and maximizing the time, especially when your CEO and CFO join you on those events. So it's really important that you identify the right kind of target audience, that you have systems through which you actually tag your investor prospects, identifying them in terms of their investment style, in terms of engagement interactions as well. What are the questions that they've asked? What are they interested in? What are the topics that are relevant to them? Are they an ESG focused investor? And are they hedge fund, passive, active? So all of these aspects really in terms of identifying who you're engaging with are really quite critical in terms of shaping, the kind of universe that you're approaching and how you're approaching them with the right kind of communication. So and of course, you're using different kind of tools to be able to do that. I think it's useful to obviously have CRM tools and targeting tools to help you actually narrow it down. But also overlaying that very scientific approach in terms of targeting is the importance in terms of using your own qualitative knowledge around the investor engagement that you've had. And if you have a wider team, it's really important to kind of utilize the notes and the descriptions and the post-meeting feedback to kind of inform that process further and refine it. But I think, as I said, it's one of the top 5, challenges that are being cited by corporate investor relations. And it's something that constantly evolves and people are trying to refine and improve on.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amani. Jenny, if I come to you next, please.
Yeah, kind of a side point, I think, probably on all of this. I think another thing that I'd add on understanding your audience is, in an age where fund managers are increasingly using AI for research and where this sort of online presence is critical for shaping perceptions, I think also be mindful of how your comms are engaging with machines as well as humans. They're increasingly sitting in between you and those the investors that you are targeting. So back to the corporate website again, I think there's a number of ways to address this, using structured data formats, extended FAQ sections, glossaries to make it easy for AI crawlers to extract key information. So, again, when we're talking about understanding the audience, scarily, we're not just talking about humans anymore. So in order to make sure those prospective investors are picking up on your messages and you're engaging in the right way, they may well be going through, not coming straight to your website, straight to you. They may be going to generative AI, which then is trawling and picking up that information. So being aware and mindful of the machines as well as the humans is a bit of a side point on that, really.
Thank you, Jenny. It's interesting. I think we could definitely do a full session in itself on the role AI has on the landscape. And we've got a couple of questions in from the audience actually on AI tools and how it relates to investor sentiment tools, things like that, which hopefully we'll come on to if we have some time. But Katie, Helen, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, so I will quickly say, so I think targeting and engaging the right investors is probably one of the most strategic parts of IR and probably one of the most nuanced. So you're not just trying to meet people, you're trying to meet the right people. And I think for that, you have to really do your homework. So you have to really understand who holds your peers, what the particular investor mandate is. Are they looking for the right kind of investment horizon? Does that match your fund? And just doing that type of homework is really important there. There are tools that exist. I think Helen probably touched on it, but like S&P Global, for example, is a great one to use. But I think also just using shareholder registers, like if you just go over your closest peers registers and understand who's buying, who's selling, who's active, I think that's a really great place to start. And I think it's also important to be realistic when you are targeting. So from a small company now, I know I'm not going to land every single meeting that I set out to, to achieve, but you've got to be consistent. You've got to keep going. And it does take, I think there's a stat saying it takes 8 different investor interactions for a sale to actually take place. So I think when you are doing investor targeting, just don't be disheartened, just have a plan, keep going. And I think that's probably key for successful IR.
Yes, no, I agree, Katie. Having a plan, I think, is the key part of it. And I agree with you. I think this really is the heart of the job. The clue's in the name, investor relations. So you really need to know your investor. And it's basically understanding what the investment styles are, where resources should be channeled. I mean, obviously at S&P, we have a lot of data and insights tools. We're helping companies globally of all sizes, non-financial corporates, financial institutions, in this. So we have a lot of access to data and insights, and we use AI extensively. I think that just coupled with that, the human interaction, providing feedback back into your CRM. So when you're meeting with these investors, to make sure that kind of comprehensive notes go back into the CRM system, enabling yourself and other colleagues to be able to understand where we are in the cycle of actually getting a meeting with a particular investor. Targeting investors and matching them with the right resource internally. Some investors will be just getting to learn about the equity story. Maybe it's just a 20-minute phone call. Some investors will be long only. It demands the CEO response. So it's the targeting of the actual investor itself, and with the correct resource internally against a comprehensive plan.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, all. Now, we've spoken about communication, we've spoken about targeting. What about tracking engagement? So what are some good touch points to consider? Would you say kind of face-to-face engagements, things like webinars, roundtables, things that are prioritizing that in person, and indeed digital engagement? Is that a good idea? What does best practice look like? Maybe if I start with you on that one, Amani.
Yes, absolutely. I think obviously, I mean, having gone through COVID, that a lot of interaction, most, if not all interaction, was obviously done virtually. And I think this kind of set a precedence in terms of future engagement, to obviously, do it now mostly as a hybrid kind of events as well. But I think nothing really beats in-person events and in-person engagements. And what we've seen over the years is obviously the importance and the rise of investor events, not in form of a full 1 day kind of capital markets day that is rather comprehensive, but much more bite-sized events that are a lot more thematic, that are more maybe product led or topical, that really showcase very specific parts of the business and allow also the specific leaders within the businesses to join the platform with CEOs and CFOs, to share their insights and their expertise, and really instill a lot of trust as well in terms of the leadership and the credibility these individuals have in terms of leading those companies. So I think these kind of activities have become really quite important. And what is really quite smart about hosting these events is the opportunity to then really take that content and basically repurpose it. So you're basically creating small bite-sized pieces of this event or this hybrid event or this webinar, and then utilize it to target very specific audiences with things that you are obviously know and have captured in terms of their preferences that are relevant to them. So again, going back to know your shareholder, know what the investor perspective is, what their interest level is, what the information requirement are, and tailor really the content that you're producing to those needs and requirements. And I think we've seen great examples of deep dives, quarterly deep dives or fireside chats with the CEO and CFO roundtables that are all company obviously sponsored and hosted. What I would say, however, is this is something that you obviously have to go in understanding that it takes a lot of resources, time, and obviously is very cost intensive. So it's something that is not done on a whim. So it has to be built into your strategic planning, and you need to obviously have your C-suite available for these events, and all of these events require a great deal of preparation and rehearsing. So these are the kind of, I guess, logistical elements that you need to be mindful of if you embark on any of those kind of investor events, investor days, analyst days, and so on and so forth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amani. Helen, what do you think?
Yes, no, I think also, giving Investor relations has the opportunity to introduce investors to different personas within the organization. So when I was in mining, we used to take investors to the mine site, and they used to really enjoy those trips, really bringing to life, what does the mining process look like? Seeing an underground mine, what does it look like? Really understanding the people on the ground, who are they, what do they do, the communities. And so there's nothing like seeing is believing. So I think, for those organizations which are in the real economy, trips to manufacturing sites, access to those those mine managers, or those divisional heads that maybe don't get that airtime, but they have a lot of nuance and a lot of detail to add to that equity story. And I think it's an opportunity to get more people to bring more of a faceted view of an equity story. I think there's a lot of data around, and I think people get a lot of data. So we're not short of data and insights. Say that coming from S&P, we've got a lot of data and insights. So I think, being able to offer that more human interaction, I think that's something that investors would really appreciate.
Definitely echo that, Helen. I think that's really, really interesting. Jenny, Katie, anything to add?
Just to agree, really. I mean, that's definitely what we've seen, a move away from big, expensive, hard to organise capital market days to these smaller, bite-sized events that are much more themed. And I think it's so true about actually giving exposure to more people within the organisation, and particularly for some of the tech businesses that I work with, just actually having access to see and understand and feel and touch the technology is fantastic. But that point as well about planning and coming back to that comms calendar and getting buy-in from others around the organisation about some of the events you want to put in, because they do take time, they do take resource, and also having that engagement of others. I always think one of the best friends to make is the EA or PA of the C-suites. Like, actually make them your best friend, because they're super helpful for helping to get that engagement and the time in the diary that's required for planning some of these events.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick comment. So I echo everything the panelists have said, but I also think you shouldn't underestimate the value of casual, low-stakes conversations. Just pick up the phone, just ask an analyst what they think about a certain thing. Like, just make sure that your investors are kept in the loop and that you have that relationship. Like, I think it's very easy to do all these kind of very formal webinars and meetings, but again, it's just a relationship you have with investors and analysts. It's really important.
Wonderful. Very, very insightful. Thank you all. So we've spoke a lot now about investors and your outward communications, but actually turning in-house and looking at the composition of your IR teams and the skill sets that might be required to build, I guess, a best-in-class team. What would you say that looks like? Amani, maybe one for you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Katie. I think that we have a slide that is kind of currently depicting what the IR team background looks like in terms of a skill set, and that has actually evolved quite significantly over the years, really following on from what we said at the very beginning in terms of the sheer multifaceted scope that investor relation now is. So it requires people with various skill set. I mean, an IRO is really a jack of all trades in many ways. And since sort of the emergence of ESG, you also need to understand not only your financial aspects, but really in terms of sustainability and ESG aspects, how that also is woven into your overall business strategy. So you need to be mindful of that. And we're seeing in the UK that actually about 26% of UK companies have actually added new resources to actually meet the demands of ESG. So there's another layer in terms of skill set that is required here. But fundamentally, financial acumen is still very key. It's actually reduced over the years and been replaced by a lot of sell-siders who moved into the space, obviously after MiFID. So we're seeing that still continually growing. We're seeing a lot more actually coming now from strategy or operations in comparison to previous years. Again, really adding great value of understanding the business and positioning the business across, the macroeconomic backdrop or the competitive landscape. Having that really inside knowledge is really quite important to establish themselves with the necessary credibility and authority. So we're seeing, quite a dynamic shift in terms of what kind of skill set. And in terms of structures of teams, as I mentioned, capacity building around ESG, but also to follow on from an earlier point, the corporate access function within investor relations has also grown over the years, and that is also impacting small cap companies in the UK. So we see that that the corporate access function has become really quite essential to the IR team structure, doing targeting, doing engagement, organizing roadshows, organizing investor engagement is a real strategic effort, as Katie mentioned, because you need to, it's not about really the number of meetings that you're organizing. I think this can be a misleading KPI for investor relations in terms of frequency of engagement. We're really, nailing down the quality of investors that you're engaging with that are actually, helping you complete on the business strategy that you set out to deliver to the market, that have a long-term view, that really fit the kind of purpose and are not necessarily only dictated, obviously, through the sell-side engagement and the conferences that the sell-side organize, but you take a very, you take ownership of that process. So we see capacity building certainly around corporate access as well, which I think is very exciting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Armani. And I just want to pick up on something you said there about sell-side professionals moving over to investor relations, because we actually have a question here from the audience. What advice would you give to someone moving across from the sell side into IR? And with that, how are the dynamic shifts on the sell side perhaps impacting IR teams? So 2 questions there, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Sorry, was that for me, Katie? Sorry.
It was indeed. Thank you, Armani.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I mean, absolutely. Yes, I mean, well, obviously, it's a growing area for sure, and I think and we see a lot of actually sell-sider, that are ranked as best in class investor relations. In fact, after they've joined the IR function, but I think it's really important to recognize that investor relations is very different, and I think the sell-side individuals mustn't assume that just because potentially they've covered the company that they know it all. I think it will be a very, very different experience for them, and an experience that they really need to dig deep into, really fully and thoroughly understand the company with everything that really makes the business. So I think it's very different, because previously as a sell-sider you would have covered many different companies in the same sector. So I think don't underestimate the kind of information that you need to gather, and the local and the internal engagement that you need to do. That's probably what I would say.
Oh, thank you very much, Armani. Now let's turn to our sustainability specialist, Helen. What are some of the trends that you would say that you're seeing in ESG and the impact of evolving sustainability reporting requirements on the investor relations landscape? What does the sustainability landscape look like from an investor perspective? And with that, what do IROs then need to focus on in this realm, would you say?
So I love the question, and thank you for asking it, Katie, because it kind of was my world, like working in investor relations in a mining company. Obviously, the ESG and sustainability facet of the equity story is key. And investors are very interested in this, and they were, 15 years ago, and they still are. Sustainability has shifted from being a separate conversation to sort of becoming integral to the capital markets discussion. We've seen that regulation is a key accelerator here, whether it's CSRD in Europe, ISSB here in the UK or globally, or investor-specific disclosure expectations. Investors are still looking for those ESG disclosures, but they're looking for these disclosures, but they're wanting these disclosures, and they want to be able to link them to risk and strategy and performance. So ESG and sustainability alone is not serving anyone. It's linking everything into the equity story. So for IROs, what do they need to know? They need to know the why behind the ESG and the sustainability data. So anyone will know who's looked at the back of an annual report or a sustainability report, there are pages and pages of data. It's for the IRO really to understand what is the trend analysis, what are the peers doing, what is the macro background. So it's really being able to speak that sustainability narrative as confidently as the financials. That's the key thing that I would say. It's crucial also, particularly when you're starting a role, to understand the maturity of your own ESG and sustainability data and where you are in relation to your peers. So investors don't expect perfection, but they do expect progress. So it's being able to understand where you are and what your roadmap is, and also how does that compare to your peer group.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. Very insightful. Sustainability and the broader sustainability landscape is, of course, something that can impact investor relations, but there's a lot of themes and trends, AI, of course, being one of that we touched on earlier. Katie, maybe one for you. How would you say that the macro environment can affect the landscape, please?
Very topical question. So I think the macro environment has a huge impact on the IR role. And in many ways, it's when the backdrop gets tough that you really feel the full weight of what the IR role actually entails. So when sentiment is strong, the numbers are good, and the momentum behind the sector is behind you, really. The job feels very straightforward. But when things do get tougher, that's when you need to be a lot more strategic. It's very much easy to tell a positive story, but when the story isn't more about stability than growth, that's a bit harder. And also, I think when the macro backdrop is a bit tougher, their managers are a lot more selective with their time. So it's really about, maintaining that visibility, making sure that you are still getting in front of people, and that when you are communicating, you are being honest and open with what's going on. I think it's just really difficult to kind of maintain that resilience and positivity when you are going through that. And I think you need to make sure that the company is aware of what's actually investor, like company specific driven, or what is macro driven. So when you're in the IR role, you do become a bit of a translator between the investor and the company, and trying to make them both align. So it's not all going to be just about macro, not all about the company. And I think you have to really understand the feedback you're receiving when things do get tough.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. Very topical indeed. Now, before we move on to the audience Q&A section, I'm keen to get one key piece of advice or one key takeaway from the panelists. So if I was someone starting out, it was new in IR today, what would be the main piece of advice that you'd give to me? Maybe if we start with you, Jenny.
Making my mute button work. I've talked about importance of real clear clarity and consistency, but the other thing I'd just say is invest in your network. Get out there and make lots of new friends. Yes, the investors, the analysts, the brokers, but also your peers, other IROs, other advisors and industry connections. I think you learn so much over a coffee, or even better over a glass of wine. And there are loads of brilliant networking events that you can tap into. The IR Society, our lovely friends here at the Stock Exchange do a great job of bringing people together. Get your name on all of these lists and expand your network, because actually that's where you learn there's so much to learn from others in your role and others around. So invest in your network, people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. I certainly couldn't agree more. And actually, that was one of the audience's questions. What networking event should I be going to? So I'm glad we've covered that off. Amani, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think I would say sort of always remain curious and never be complacent, because I think it's in the heart of investor relations where, everything shifts and changes so quickly. You need to constantly review what you're doing, and you need to, get feedback from the market on how effective, whether it is your reporting or your engagement or your investor events are. I think, making assumptions over just because you've optimized something or you've changed something that this is ultimately, successful and effective, I think would be misleading. I think questioning yourself a little bit on that and use the feedback from the market to shape what you're doing and continually improve what you're doing, because, as they say, perception is reality. And I think, making decisions around how you do things in the vacuum, I think is really kind of dangerous. You need to be able to benchmark against peers. So I think, taking a much more sort of less introspective view on what you're doing, and using feedback from the market to shape and improve what you're doing, I think is really quite important, because again, you're sharing the platform with hundreds, if not thousands, of companies. So you need to stand out. You need to understand, what your position is, how that compares to your peers, and continually improve upon that.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Helen, what about you?
I mean, I agree with everything. I think I would say time management is really key. So anyone that's done the role, there'll be people listening thinking, I haven't got time even to listen to this 1 hour of webinar. Is that, it's a very time pressured role. And I think the critical thing is really, know thyself, really understand your equity story, understand what your calendar looks like, what do you need to bring to the table at different points of the year, who do you need to help you internally and externally, and, overarching, just to enjoy the role. It's a great opportunity for anyone. It's very fun. You get to travel, you get to meet a lot of interesting people, and you learn deeply about the global capital market. And I think it's a great privilege to have the opportunity.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And Katie.
Thanks. So I think when you're starting the role, you're at quite an advantage in that you're not expected to know anything at that point. So you can just ask questions. Like in like a year or two time, if you ask the same questions, you'll look a bit stupid. So you have the opportunity to really ask whatever questions you have. As Amani was saying, be curious, take notes. And I think, as soon as you're starting out, just ask as many questions as you can to fully understand things, because eventually people are coming to you with the questions. So this is your opportunity now to really get ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much, ladies. I thought that was an absolutely fantastic conversation. We're certainly not done yet. We are moving on to 10 minutes of audience Q&A. I have a lot of these that have come in here throughout the course of the conversation, so thank you very much to our lovely audience. If we don't get a chance to answer your question over the next 10 minutes, I'm sure all 4 of our panelists would be more than happy if you got in touch with them directly, so please feel free to do so. But we've got an interesting question here, maybe one for you, Helen. Someone has asked, what do my first 100 days look like as an IRO?
So, I mean, touching on what we've been talking about, know thyself, get to understand what is the equity story, who are the chief protagonists, who knows what, understanding the key investors, what their investment preferences are, what their investment styles are, looking at peer analysis. I think the first 100 days is all about discovery, really sitting back and being fed, going across the organization, understanding this business strategy, and identifying the key stakeholders, the people who are in charge of setting the strategy, maintaining the strategy, and also crucially for IRO, the people that are in charge of giving the information about performance, because that is the key thing that you need to know in your role. How is the company doing?
Excellent. Thank you, Helen. And we've got a question here on digitization. It says, should companies be looking to increase digital IR, and what are some of the trends with digitization? Jenny, what do you think about that one?
Good question. I think digitization in investor relations, it is evolving rapidly with lots of key trends shaping the landscape. Couple of bits I touched on. I think if you think about enhanced transparency for a starter, there's this massive growing demand for transparency and real-time information, and there's so many tools out there now that are helping companies to provide timely updates and detailed disclosures, which in turn are helping to build trust, credibility with investors. So we work with tools like Workiva that help companies to streamline the process of financial reporting and disclosure. And they sort of ensure that compliance with regulatory requirements, but also provide that real-time updates for investors. So I'd say, yeah, absolutely, embrace technology. It can really help to bring information together in a much more time-effective way that also supports that consistency that we want. And there's lots of different things out there, so explore. And but yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jenny. And perhaps another one for you, actually. Somebody's asked here, how does a potential new listed company prepare for its IR function pre-IPO?
Oh my goodness, strap in and get ready for the roller coaster. Big question. I think if I take it more from a kind of comms angle, I'd say again, start by really looking and making sure you're all clear on what that narrative is, that story that is highlighting the company's value proposition, your growth potential, vision for the future, a narrative that can then be really consistent across all communications, and make sure everybody's on board with that. Really, really important. Also, start thinking much more about regulatory compliance. There's loads of things as a listed company that you are going to have to adhere to that pre-IPO you don't have to worry about. So the more of that stuff you can get in place before your IPO, it really helps you later on. So working really closely with your legal and finance teams to make sure your statements are complying with SEC disclosure rules, for example, and other requirements. And then getting that IR website up and running. Your website will need to change. There's new things you're going to need to include. The structure of it will be different. So getting that absolutely ready with all that narrative going through, but ready to go live on the day of your IPO pricing. And then I think there's other things as well to start thinking about. I think the moment you move into that sort of listed company space and all the preparations towards IPO, you're exposing your leadership team to a lot more meetings, presentations. So also understand what they're good at and what they're not good at, and sometimes some good presentation coaching goes a long way. So there's lots of kind of softer things that also you should be thinking about, and just preparing from a comms perspective, your overall brand, so it's ready for life as a listed company. It's a roller coaster and but loads of fun, and but just get yourself really tight as a team. Make sure everybody knows what their role is within that, and everyone's on board. And also, I guess the other thing is just about really thinking about how you control your comms, because obviously there's so much that you can't talk about. And so I think one of the challenges as an IR team when you're thinking about IPO is often internally lots of people won't know what's going on, and so it's knowing who that kind of circle of trust, if you like, that are in the loop that you can lean on, but also how you are managing and controlling those comms around that. So a few bits there.
Really, really interesting. Thank you, Jenny. It's something we touched on earlier, the importance of gathering feedback and benchmarking success. Maybe one for you, Amani. We've got a question here asking just that. What is the importance of getting feedback? What is the importance of benchmarking?
Yeah, I mean, it's been cited by our corporate investor relations officers as one of the top priorities for 2025. So it's something that is certainly being focused on. I think where there is so much information out there, I believe there's a quote around we consume in one day as much information as people in previous centuries in 30 years. So there is a lot of information out there on companies, on or data generally. So I think it's really important that you use the feedback or leverage the feedback to kind of identify pain points, to identify, preferences, thoughts, things that investors are questioning about in terms of, maybe business strategies. So I think it's really important to stay close to the investor sentiment, because that ultimately will shape the strategy of the business. That ultimately is the feedback that you give back to management, so they can actually take a proactive approach and potentially mitigate any kind of risk, reputational risk, or shareholder activism, for instance. I think feedback is really key to, again, we go back to an original point, to control the narrative, mitigate risk, and to ensure that you have the right kind of information to continually improve upon what you're currently doing. And I think that is really quite key to investor relations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amani. Helen, you might have some thoughts on that as well, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, just to enhance that, to spot red flags early, because that is a key part of the role as a gatekeeper. We need to see what are those red flags coming down the line. That could be from what your peers are up to. It could be a macro backdrop. So, using feedback and benchmarking to spot what could be coming up next from a reputational perspective, and also to help shape messaging for kind of key capital market events moving forward. So just really being able to have those ears and eyes on the market and being able to pick out signals that are relevant for what you need for today and maybe 2-3 months down the line.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think we've probably got time for one more. So I have a question here focused on internal communication. So we've spoken a lot about communicating with your investors, but this might be slightly different to the way you communicate with internal stakeholders, you communicate with media, proxy advisors, so on. So any thoughts on that internal communication piece? Maybe one for you, Amani?
Yeah, sure. I think I mentioned at the beginning that this is a big part of IR engagement. It takes up about 38% of any kind of engagement. And it's something that is really important because it, the more stronger or the stronger your relationships are internally, the better, I think, the IR professional, because ultimately these are individuals, business leaders, whether you're looking at specific operational businesses, or you're looking at CSR, you're looking at compliance, HR. These are all elements that will help you shape your narrative and will help kind of tie together the puzzles of the investment narrative of the company. So I think it's really important to continually engage with your stakeholders internally, to develop and nurture those relationships. And also for some companies, it's really important to educate internally employees on investor relations, what actually the function does and what the value of IR is, because then you get a lot more support and people are a lot more invested in the process of supporting you as a function and providing relevant information that you can then pass on to the market as part of your strategic communication.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Amani. I truly believe we could go on all day, and that is exactly what we will be doing on the 7th of May. The London Stock Exchange actually has an in-person investor relations and sustainability masterclass, so some of our audience might find that of interest. If you do, you can register for that on Spark, the same page you've registered for this webinar. But ladies, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an incredibly insightful discussion. I've certainly learned a lot, really enjoyed it, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you to the audience for watching as well.